At 10 a.m. on the 13th of June 1907 in Yerevan Square, Tiflis, two bank stagecoaches were moving slowly under heavy guard. Suddenly, bombs rained down from the sky, the deafening blasts shattering every window in the vicinity. Immediately following came a barrage of gunfire. Amidst the billowing smoke, masked men seized two sacks stuffed with rubles. 40 dead bodies were left at the scene, blood flowing like rivers. This is not a movie. This was the most earth-shattering bank robbery of the early 20th century, and sitting in a café on the edge of the square, a gaunt young man watched it all with cold detachment. He fired no shots, threw no bombs. He was the orchestrator of this slaughter. At the time, people called him Koba, but decades later, the world would tremble to speak his other name, Stalin. For a long time, people called Stalin So-So. That was the name of a poor boy from Gori, a remote town in Georgia. If you were to travel back to Gori in the 1,880 seconds, you would find a place rife with violence, alcoholism, and street brawls. The men here subscribed to an ancient philosophy of the Caucasus mountaineers. Honor is above all, and fists are the only tool to defend it. So-So's father, Bukharin, was a cobbler. This man's life could be summarized by two sounds, the pounding of a hammer on shoes and the popping of corks from bottles. Bukharin was once a skilled craftsman, but alcohol quickly ruined him. When drunk, Bukharin turned into a beast. Little So-So's childhood memories were filled with his father's heavy belt and fists. Once, Bukharin lifted his son up and threw him violently to the ground, causing So-So to urinate blood for days. Another time, to protect his mother, little So-So threw a knife at his father and then fled through a window. He hid in a neighbor's house for days until his father's rage subsided. This extreme domestic violence taught the young Stalin the most important lesson of his life, a lesson more profound than any book he would later read. The lesson was this: in this world, there is no reasoning. The strong define the truth. If you don't want to be beaten, you must become the one holding the belt. He learned to endure. Neighbors recalled that the boy was exceptionally stubborn when being beaten. He would grit his teeth, face pale, but never cry or beg for mercy. He was accumulating hatred that would later transform into a natural hostility toward all authority figures, whether the Tsar, priests, or later, his rivals within the party. But it wasn't just the violent father who shaped Stalin's character. It was also his contradictory mother, Keke. Keke was a devout Orthodox Christian. She was beautiful, resilient, and fiercely ambitious for her son. In those days, the only way for a poor boy to make something of himself was to become a priest. This was Keke's greatest dream for her son, to see him in vestments, preaching in a church. For this dream, Keke made immense sacrifices. She took in laundry, did sewing, and even endured gossip, all to pay for her son's schooling. She loved So-So deeply, for of the 4 children she bore, only So-So survived. He was a gift from God. However, Keke's love also had thorns. When the father wasn't beating So-So, the mother was. She used corporal punishment to urge her son to study and strict discipline to ensure he didn't go astray. This twisted love fostered a very unique psychological mechanism in Stalin. He relied on his mother but wanted to escape her control. He craved love but deeply suspected it. In his later years, when visiting his aging mother, Stalin asked her, "Mama, why did you beat me so much back then?" Keke gave an answer that left Stalin speechless. "It is because of that you are alive and well today." Beyond the trauma of family, Stalin's body also bore the marks of inferiority. At age 7, he contracted smallpox. Although he survived, his face was left permanently pockmarked. This later earned him the nickname Pockmarked Ossip. For a boy of intense vanity, this was a devastating blow. At age 12, he was hit by a carriage, severely injuring his left arm and stunning its bone development. His left arm was shorter than his right and atrophied. If you look closely at later photos of Stalin, you will notice he always habitually tucked his left hand into his uniform pocket or held a pipe to conceal this defect. A poor, pockmarked, disabled boy on the margins, how could he find his place in this cruel world? He chose intellectual bullying. "Since I don't have the physical advantage, I will crush you with my intellect." He excelled in school with an astonishing memory, but he was also the most troublesome student. He loved to control others, to be the ringleader. If anyone disobeyed him, he would retaliate with the most insidious methods. In 1894, thanks to his excellent grades, Stalin was admitted to the Tiflis Theological Seminary. This was a turning point. Many biographers gloss over this period, assuming he simply studied there for a few years and dropped out. Wrong. The Tiflis Theological Seminary was Stalin's true political military academy. What he learned there was not how to love God, but how to manage a political party and a nation just as the church managed its believers. The seminary at that time was less a school and more a spiritual prison. The atmosphere was grim and oppressive, the air thick with the smell of sauerkraut and cheap tobacco. The monks who ran the seminary enforced a quasi-military discipline that bordered on the pathological. What was their most important management tool? Surveillance and informing. In the seminary, students had no privacy. Monks would spy on students in their dorms through peepholes in the doors at any time. They would conduct sudden searches of personal belongings looking for banned books. They encouraged students to denounce one another. Whoever reported a rule breaker received a reward. Young Stalin hated this system, but he was simultaneously deeply fascinated by its effectiveness. He discovered that as long as you establish an all-pervasive surveillance network and hold the secrets of everyone's heart, a minority can absolutely control the majority. He learned two things in the seminary that would later become the core logic of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. 1. A dogmatic view of truth. In the church, truth is singular, written in the Bible, and unquestionable. You either believe or you are a heretic. There is no middle ground, no room for debate. Stalin later perfectly transplanted this logic onto Marxism. To him, Marx's Das Kapital was the new Bible, Lenin was the new prophet, and he himself was the sole interpreter, the Pope. Anyone who dared to offer a differing opinion was a heretic who must be burned at the stake. 2. The necessity of purges. To maintain purity, the seminary would periodically expel students with incorrect thoughts. This taught Stalin that for an organization to be strong, it must constantly detoxify. It was inside this oppressive monastery that Stalin began his rebellion. He read banned books ravenously, from the novels of Victor Hugo to Darwin's Origin of Species, and finally to the works of Marx. He found a new power in books' revolution. He began organizing secret reading circles in the dorms and distributing handwritten newsletters. He relished the thrill of conducting underground activities under strict surveillance. This was the first time he displayed his astonishing talent for underground work. He could always evade the monks' searches, hiding banned books in the most unthinkable places. He could always accurately identify who was a comrade and who was an informer. It was also during this period that he gave himself a new name, Koba. This name came from a popular novel of the time, The Patricide. The protagonist, Koba, was a righteous bandit from the Caucasus Mountains. He fought for justice, sought revenge by any means necessary, spoke little, but was lethal every time he struck. Young Soso was deeply obsessed with this character. He wanted to transform himself into the real-life Koba. The name Koba represented his break with the past. He was no longer the cobbler's son, no longer the good student of the seminary, and no longer the obedient child in his mother's eyes. He was to become an avenger. In 1899, due to missing exams and propagating heretical ideas, Stalin was expelled from the seminary. Some accounts say he quit. When he walked out of those heavy seminary gates, he didn't take with him the gospel of God, but a complete totalitarian operations manual. He hated those monks, but he became the most powerful monk of all. At this time in Europe, revolutionary mentors like Lenin and Plekhanov were sitting in cafés in Switzerland or Paris, drinking coffee and debating the philosophical details of Marxism and elegant French. They were theorists, intellectuals living in a world of concepts. But 20-year-old Koba dove headfirst into the slums, oil fields, and basements of the Caucasus. He had no money, no fame, no noble degree. He had only a chest full of rage and the machinations he had learned from the seminary. He was about to enter a world more cruel than the seminary, the revolutionary underground. There were no debates, only survival. And in that dark quagmire, Koba would take to it like a fish to water, evolving into a true wolf of the Caucasus. Walking out of the seminary gates, Stalin, or Koba, dove headfirst into the oil industrial zones of Baku and Batumi. If you wanted to find hell on earth, Baku at that time was it. It was the capital of black gold in the early 1900s. The Nobel and Rothschild families owned massive refineries there. The air was perpetually filled with the acrid smell of sulfur and petroleum fumes, and the ground was slick with black grease. Tens of thousands of workers labored like slaves in environments with zero protection. working 14 to 16 hours a day and living in barracks that resembled cattle sheds. High-minded Marxist theory wasn't needed here. What was needed was the spark of hatred, and Koba was the man holding the torch. 22-year-old Koba took to this environment like a fish to water. The agitational and organizational skills he had honed in the seminary were put to their ultimate use here. Wearing a tattered coat stained with oil, he mingled with the workers, using coarse language that Georgian peasants could understand, telling them, "Your blood is turned into gold in the boss's pocket. Burn the factory down." He orchestrated the famous Batumi refinery strike. Even when police opened fire to suppress it, he stood on the front lines, directing workers to fight back with stones. In the eyes of those workers, this small, pock-marked young man was more trustworthy than any priest, because he was ruthless, and he was loyal to the cause. But strikes alone were not enough. Revolution required money, vast amounts of it. Printing presses cost money, fake passports cost money, buying guns and explosives cost money, supporting the big shots living in exile in Europe cost money. Where would the money come from? The pitiful dues of the workers? A drop in the bucket. So, Koba developed his second core skill, revolutionary gangsterism. He organized a private militia known as the Outfit. The composition of this group was extremely complex, ranging from radical students to local thugs and even professional bandits. Koba was their godfather. What did they do? Kidnapping, extortion, robbery. Koba invented a highly efficient fundraising method, protection money, targeting oil tycoons. He would send someone to deliver a letter to a capitalist containing only one sentence: "If you don't want your oil wells to catch fire tomorrow, please donate 50,000 rubles. If they refused, the wells would invariably catch fire the next day. Soon, the capitalists of Baku learned their lesson and paid up obediently. But this piecemeal income couldn't satisfy the Bolsheviks' appetite. Lenin in Europe was in desperate need of funds. Thus, Koba planned the most earth-shattering scene of his life, the 1907 Tiflis bank robbery. The scene we mentioned at the beginning was the climax of this drama. Koba prepared for this operation for months. Using his insider at the post office, he obtained the precise route and timing of the stagecoaches. He assigned a mad killer from his crew named Kamo to lead the execution. Kamo was a legend in his own right. He once blew himself up and was severely injured while testing explosives. After being captured, he endured heinous torture without uttering a word just to feign insanity. He was Koba's most loyal hound. That morning, when Kamo threw the bombs at the stagecoaches, the entire square turned into a battlefield. 40 people died, over 50 were injured, and horses were blown to pieces. In the chaos, the robbers made off with 340,000 rubles. This was an astronomical sum at the time, equivalent to millions of dollars today. Although Koba himself did not throw a bomb, he always prudently directed from a safe zone hundreds of meters away. This money was a massive gift he presented to Lenin. However, this event also exposed Koba's awkward position within the party. When the Mensheviks and other European socialists heard about this, they were shocked. They accused it of being criminal activity that smeared the revolution, demanding the expulsion of Koba and Lenin. This created a very interesting contrast. In Geneva and London, the Menshevik gentlemen wore suits, drank coffee, and discussed morality and law. In the mud of the Caucasus, Koba wore broken boots, risked hanging, and used bombs and pistols to get money for the party. Although Lenin had to publicly distance himself from the robbery, privately, he loved Koba for it. Lenin once said to those around him, "We need people like this. What use are those intellectuals who only know empty talk? We need people who can do the dirty work." This was Koba's positioning in the early party, Lenin's black glove. He gained power because of this positioning, but he was also deeply despised by the high-level intellectuals in the party because of it. Trotsky later recalled Stalin from this period using one word: gray. He felt this man was vulgar, uncultured, capable only of intrigue, and completely unworthy of the main stage. This disdain would later cost Trotsky his life. Because he didn't understand, revolution is not a dinner party. Revolution is violence, and Koba was an expert in violence. Besides making money and causing destruction, another experience during this period profoundly reshaped Stalin exile. From 1902 to 1917, Stalin was arrested 7 times, exiled 6 times, and escaped 5 times. In those days, the Tsarist exile system was relatively loose. Exile locations were usually remote villages in Siberia. Although cold, There were no walls, and one could even receive letters and packages. Many revolutionaries read, wrote, and fell in love in exile, treating it like a revolutionary university. But Stalin's life in exile was different. His final exile was in 1913, to Koba, inside the Arctic Circle. It was a true wilderness, with winter temperatures dropping to -50 degrees and polar nights lasting for months. Apart from a few indigenous Tungus people and the gendarmes monitoring him, there was no human habitation for hundreds of miles. There, Stalin displayed astonishing survival skills. He learned to fish with traps and hunt in blizzards. More importantly, he became extremely solitary and cold. Other exiles usually gathered together for warmth and conversation, but not Stalin. He preferred solitude. He even fell out with fellow inmates over trivial matters, like who should wash the dishes, and wouldn't speak a word for months. Once, he went hunting alone in a blizzard and didn't return for days. Everyone thought he was dead, but he returned, dragging his prey, like a savage, his eyes filled with disdain for the weak. This experience stripped away the last bit of humanity in him. In the face of nature's extreme cruelty and long solitude, Stalin became certain of one thing: only the strongest, coldest, and most enduring creatures survive. Compassion, that is for the dead. In February 1917, the Tsarist regime collapsed in a sudden revolution. The gates of the Siberian prisons opened. 39-year-old Stalin, wearing a worn-out black coat and carrying a wicker suitcase, jumped onto a train bound for Petrograd Street, Petersburg. He was no longer the seminary student Soso, nor was he just the bank-robbing Koba. He was a professional revolutionary, baptized by ice and fire. But he was still lonely. When he stepped off the train into the boiling revolutionary center of Petrograd, he found it was still the domain of intellectuals. Those big shots, returning from Europe, Trotsky, Zinoviev, Kamenev, were delivering rousing speeches from balconies, basking in the cheers of the masses. No one noticed the silent Georgian smoking a pipe in the corner. Even in group photos, he stood on the most inconspicuous edge. Sukhanov, a famous Menshevik chronicler, when recording the scenes of 1917, wrote contemptuously, "Stalin, in this process he was nothing but a gray blur, flickering in and out, leaving no trace." A gray blur. These brilliant intellectuals made a fatal mistake. They thought power belonged only to those in the spotlight. They didn't know that the man filling out forms, arranging personnel, and controlling access in the dark was the real danger. Stalin didn't need a spotlight. What he needed was a filing cabinet. All right, we have arrived at 1917. This was the most chaotic, most raucous, yet most hope-filled and despair-ridden year in human history. The Tsar had fallen, the provisional government was teetering, and Lenin had returned. The streets of Petrograd were crowded daily with marching throngs and even deserters. The flames of passion burned in the very air. In this grand historical drama, everyone was scrambling to be the protagonist. Trotsky spoke to crowds of 5,000 at the modern circus theater, his voice ringing like metal, driving listeners into a frenzy. Lenin stood on the balcony of the Kshezinskaya Palace, waving his arms and declaring to the world the arrival of the socialist revolution. But where was our leading man, Stalin? He was in the editorial office, laying out newspaper pages. He was in smoke-filled meeting rooms, taking minutes. He was in the corner of a hallway, smoking his pipe. This is part 3. The Gray Blur, 1917, and the Danger Ignored. The Russian Revolution of 1917 was like a grand masquerade ball. All the political elites arrived wearing masks, the orators, the theorists, the agitators. On this dazzling stage, Stalin seemed out of place. He lacked Lenin's profound theoretical insight and couldn't write a masterpiece like State and Revolution, nor did he have Trotsky's flamboyant eloquence. Standing at the podium, he spoke Russian with a heavy Georgian accent that wasn't even standard. The famous Menshevik chronicler Nikolai Sukhanov, after observing the entire Bolshevik high command, delivered a famous verdict on Stalin. In this process, he was nothing but a gray blur, flickering in and out, leaving no trace. This quote has been cited by countless historians to prove Stalin's mediocrity, but Sukhanov was wrong, dead wrong. He committed the most common error of intellectuals, judging a hero by talent while ignoring function. During the peak of a revolution, talent is indeed dazzling. But when the tide of revolution recedes, when tons of documents need processing, hundreds of local party branches need coordinating, and endless personnel disputes need resolving, talent is useless. What is needed then is a precise machine. Stalin was that machine. While other leaders were busy basking in cheers under the spotlight, what was Stalin doing? He was doing the dirty work no one else wanted to do. He was the party's most diligent committee expert. He was an editor for Pravda, reviewing every article. He was a secretary for the Central Committee, arranging meeting agendas. He was the People's Commissar for Nationalities, dealing with the tangled mess of ethnic issues within Russia. This gave him control over a core resource that no one else possessed: information flow. Trotsky might have known the grand theories of world revolution, but he didn't know the name of the party secretary in a specific district of Petrograd, nor which unit at the front was short on bread. But Stalin knew. This grayness was actually Stalin's best camouflage, because he looked so ordinary, so non-threatening. All the big shots, Zinoviev, Kamenev, even Lenin, treated him as a useful assistant rather than a competitor. They all thought, let this Georgian do the boring administrative work. He won't amount to much anyway. This was exactly what Stalin wanted. While you argue over who is God, I am quietly taking the keys to the church doors. However, if Stalin were merely a mediocre bureaucrat, he would at most have become a high-level secretary. What truly transformed him from a bureaucrat into a dictator was a baptism by blood and fire, the Russian Civil War. In 1918, the Bolsheviks had just seized power and faced a ferocious counterattack from the White Army. The nascent Soviet regime was in peril, and the biggest crisis was famine. Moscow and Petrograd were running out of food. Lenin called Stalin in and gave him a mission. Go to Tsaritsyn in the south and get us grain, at any cost. Tsaritsyn, a city that would later bear a more resounding name, Stalingrad. This was the starting point of Stalin's military career, and the first place he tasted absolute power. When Stalin arrived in Tsaritsyn with 2 armored trains and 400 Red Army soldiers, he found the situation worse than expected. The White Army was encircling the city, which was teeming with counter-revolutionaries and profiteers, and the Red Army command was in chaos. What would Trotsky have done? He would have sent professional military advisors to formulate a detailed battle plan. But Stalin's approach was simple and brutal. Upon arriving in Tsaritsyn, he immediately declared he was taking over supreme military command of the city, even though Lenin had only sent him to get grain. He did 3 things, which served as a preview of his later ruling style. 1. Purging the experts. The commander-in-chief of the Red Army, Trotsky, advocated using the military talent of former Tsarist officers, calling them military specialists. Stalin sneered at this. In Tsaritsyn, he openly defied Trotsky's orders, arresting and executing large numbers of old Tsarist officers. He declared, "I don't trust these fellows with gold epaulets. We have our own proletarian commanders." Here, he promoted a group of rough but absolutely loyal generals, such as Voroshilov and Budyani. This group later formed the famous Tsaritsyn clique, becoming the most solid foundation for Stalin's future seizure of power. 2. Institutionalized terror. To solve the grain problem and the counter-revolutionary problem, Stalin invented a horrific method of execution in Tsaritsyn, the death barge. He stuffed captured so-called white bandits, speculators, and unreliable officers into a huge barge on the Volga River. When it was full, the boat was towed to the middle of the river and scuttled, or they would simply set up machine guns on the boat and open fire. No trials, no records, only death. The telegram Stalin sent to Lenin was chilling. Rest assured, our hands will not tremble. 3. Challenging authority. The defense of Tsaritsyn effectively became the first head-on confrontation between Stalin and Trotsky. As the People's Commissar for War, Trotsky could no longer tolerate Stalin's recklessness. He sent telegrams rebuking Stalin for destroying military discipline and even threatened to court-martial him. How did Stalin respond? He wrote on a telegram with utter contempt for Trotsky, "I pay no attention to his orders." Although Lenin eventually stepped in to mediate and recalled Stalin to Moscow, the seed of hatred had been sown. In Trotsky's eyes, Stalin was a rude barbarian, ignorant of the art of war, who nearly ruined the Tsaritsyn defense line. But in Stalin's eyes, Trotsky was an arrogant, high and mighty scholar who understood nothing of class struggle. This trip to Tsaritsyn thoroughly changed Stalin. Before, he was just a party worker, filling out forms behind the scenes. Now, he had commanded thousands of troops, decided the life and death of multitudes, and dared to challenge the party's number 2 figure, Trotsky. He discovered that in a state of war, violence is more effective than theory. Fear works better than persuasion. When the Civil War ended in 1920, Stalin returned to Moscow. Now, he wore the Order of the Red Banner on his chest and was surrounded by a group of Tsaritsyn clique soldiers who were fiercely loyal to him. He was no longer just that gray blur. He was a wolf that had tasted blood. Meanwhile, the party high command was still immersed in the joy of victory. Lenin's health began to deteriorate, and the question of succession loomed. Everyone's eyes were on Trotsky. He was the father of the Red Army, the brilliant genius, the expected successor. No one was looking at Stalin, and Stalin was silently moving toward a position that no one noticed, a position that seemed utterly boring. The title of this position was considered at the time to be for handling miscellaneous chores, general secretary. In the eyes of people back then, this was just the head secretary. But Stalin smiled, because he saw through the earth-shattering secret hidden behind this title. Whoever controls the personnel files controls the party. Whoever controls the party controls the state. A spectacular Trojan horse operation was about to unfold. On the 3rd of April 1922, the plenum of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union passed a resolution appointing Stalin as the General Secretary of the Central Committee. Please note, although today when we hear the term General Secretary, the image of a supreme leader comes to mind, at that time, this position was brand new. To many big shots, it was nothing more than a glorified clerk. Lenin was the leader, Trotsky was the military commander, and Zinoviev was the chairman of the Comintern. They were all busy guiding the world revolution, writing theoretical articles, and delivering speeches to crowds of thousands who wanted to sit in an office all day, processing thousands of boring personnel files, who wanted to coordinate the petty squabbles of local party branches over a few wagon loads of grain. No one, except Stalin. And so the other leaders were quite happy to dump this chore on Stalin. They thought, let this diligent Georgian be our housekeeper. We will do the thinking, and he will do the legwork. These geniuses made the most naive mistake in political science. They did not know administrative power is political power. Stalin sat in that smoke-filled office in the Kremlin. He held no gun in his hand, only boxes of index cards. But he had discovered the true essence of power. The Soviet Union was then in the process of building a massive bureaucracy. Thousands of vacancies needed to be filled. Provincial party secretaries, factory directors, military commissars. Who decided who filled these roles? Previously, it was chaotic. Now, it was General Secretary Stalin. Stalin began a silent deployment. Whenever a vacancy appeared, he wouldn't select the most talented person or the one who understood Marxism best. No, that type was too arrogant and hard to control. He would select the most obedient, the most mediocre, the easiest to control. Imagine you are an inconspicuous, low-level party member in the Ural Mountains. You have average ability and no hope for promotion. Suddenly, a transfer order from Moscow arrives, promoting you to the local party secretary. Who are you grateful to? To whom do you pledge loyalty? You won't pledge loyalty to Trotsky, who writes articles in the newspapers. You will pledge loyalty to Comrade Stalin, who personally signed your appointment order. And so, year after year, day after day, like a diligent spider, Stalin used his power of appointment to insert thousands of his people into the nerve endings of the empire. These people were called the apparatchiks, machine men. They might not have understood theory, but they understood who gave them their rice bowl. When Trotsky used flowery rhetoric at Politburo meetings to mock Stalin's mediocre views, he didn't realize that while the man sitting across from him remained silent, outside the meeting room, throughout the entire grassroots organization of the party everyone already belonged to, Stalin. However, one person saw through it all. That was Lenin. By late 1922, Lenin was gravely ill. A stroke had left him partially paralyzed and confined to the Gorky villa outside Moscow. Stalin was nominally responsible for taking care of Lenin, but in reality, he became his jailer. Stalin strictly controlled who could see Lenin, what newspapers Lenin could read, and even cut the villa's telephone lines. He wanted to ensure Lenin's influence was physically isolated so he could take over the reins of power. The conflict finally erupted. One day, Stalin learned that Lenin's wife, Krupskaya, had violated his ban and read Lenin a document regarding internal Politburo disputes. Stalin flew into a rage. He picked up the phone, called Krupskaya. and unleashed a torrent of crude abuse upon the mother of the revolution, even threatening to drag her to court. This incident thoroughly enraged Lenin on his sickbed. He realized that this loyal assistant he had personally supported had turned into an uncontrollable monster. With a trembling hand, Lenin dictated the last and most important document of his life, Lenin's testament. In this testament, Lenin evaluated all his successors, but his assessment of Stalin was the most devastating. Listen to this passage. Comrade Stalin, having become General Secretary, has unlimited authority concentrated in his hands, and I am not sure whether he will always be capable of using that authority with sufficient caution. Stalin is too rude, and this defect becomes intolerable in a General Secretary. That is why I suggest that the comrades think about a way of removing Stalin from that post and appointing another man. This was the most dangerous moment of Stalin's political career. If this testament were read aloud at the party congress, Stalin's political life would be over. Lenin's word was law. No one dared defy it. In January 1924, Lenin died. In May, the 13th Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union convened. This was Stalin's judgment day. Lenin's testament was handed to the high-ranking members of the Politburo. Stalin sat there, face pale, gripping his pipe tightly. He knew he was finished. He even offered to resign. But just then, a miracle happened. Or rather, the stupidity of his enemies saved him. At the time, the troika within the party, Stalin, Zinoviev, and Kamenev, had formed an alliance. Why? Because they shared a common, more feared enemy, Trotsky. In Zinoviev's view, Trotsky was too powerful, held military command, and was brilliantly talented. If Trotsky took power, men like them would be pushed aside. And Stalin? Stalin was rude, yes, but he was one of us. He didn't have that much ambition, or so they thought. And he controlled the party machine, which could help them fight Trotsky. So Zinoviev stood up. He spoke words at that high-level meeting that changed history. Comrades, we are all aware of the weight of Lenin's testament. However, we are also happy to observe that Comrade Lenin's fears regarding Stalin have not been confirmed. Over the past few months, Comrade Stalin has proven himself a loyal party member. And so, under the strenuous protection of Zinoviev and Kamenev, Lenin's testament was put on ice. It was not read publicly to the General Assembly. It was only communicated within small delegation circles, and note-taking was prohibited. Stalin kept his position as General Secretary. At that moment, looking at Zinoviev's smug face, Stalin must have sneered internally. These two fools, they thought they were keeping a watchdog to deal with Trotsky, not realizing they had just stuck their own necks into the noose. The Trojan horse had entered the city. Night fell, the belly of the horse opened, and soldiers with drawn blades leaped out. Now, Stalin held great power, and Lenin's curse was sealed. Only one final step remained before him: how to devour these former allies, now rivals, one by one. In 1924, Lenin died. The power vacuum in the Kremlin had arrived. The Soviet political scene at the time was like a powder keg. Several big shots despised one another. Everyone held a gun, but no one dared to fire first. If we were to rank the power players of that time, Stalin wouldn't even make the top 3. Number 1 was undoubtedly Trotsky, the creator of the Red Army, radiant and brilliant. Number 2 was Zinoviev, chairman of the Comintern, Lenin's old steward. Number 3 was Kamenev, the party boss of Moscow, Lenin's deputy. Number 4 might have been Bukharin, the party theorist, editor-in-chief of Pravda. Stalin, in their eyes, he was still that gray blur responsible for fetching tea and managing files. But it was precisely this arrogance that killed them all. Stalin adopted a tactic known as salami tactics, slicing the sausage. He would never declare war on everyone at once. He would slice off one piece at a time, eat it, digest it, and then cut the next slice. Stalin's first target was the most dazzling and dangerous rival, Trotsky. But Stalin was smart. He knew his eloquence was lacking and his theory weak. In a one-on-one debate, Trotsky would tear him to shreds. So, he exploited the jealousy of Zinoviev and Kamenev. These two senior Bolsheviks had long resented Trotsky. In their eyes, Trotsky was an arrogant newcomer. Why should he climb over their heads? Stalin proactively reached out to these two giants, forming the famous Troika. In this alliance, Stalin kept a low profile. He let Zinoviev charge the front lines while he hid backstage, providing ammunition, the black material from the personnel files. When Zinoviev frantically attacked Trotsky at party congresses as a Menshevik heretic and anti-Leninist, Stalin sat aside, playing the role of a moderate mediator. He even hypocritically said, "We cannot cut out Trotsky. He is a talent of the party." This performance fooled everyone. People felt Zinoviev was aggressive, while Stalin was honest and kind. The result was that Trotsky was isolated and stripped of military power. The strongest lion had been driven off the savannah by 2 foxes and a wolf. Once Trotsky fell, Zinoviev and Kamenev realized something was wrong. They'd assumed Stalin was just a lackey, but now they discovered with horror that this lackey, through his position as general secretary, had replaced the party secretaries of every province and city with his own men. Zinoviev tried to issue an order, only to find that no one listened to him. The 2 giants panicked. They tried to fight back. They even swallowed their pride and ran to ally with the fallen Trotsky, forming the so-called United Opposition. But in Stalin's eyes, this looked like a dance of political zombies. This time, Stalin found a new ally, Bukharin. Bukharin was the party's right wing, advocating moderate economic policies and allowing peasants to get rich. Zinoviev and his group were the left wing, advocating the expropriation of peasants for industrialization. Stalin immediately stood with Bukharin, shouting slogans of protecting peasant interests. He branded Zinoviev and Kamenev as criminals, destroying the worker-peasant alliance. Even more ironically, Stalin used the very party rule regarding the ban on factionalism, which Zinoviev himself had invented years earlier, to accuse them of forming an anti-party clique. It was a slaughter. In 1927, Zinoviev and Kamenev were expelled from the party. To save their lives, these 2 once insufferable giants had to write self-criticisms like primary school students, admitting that Stalin was wise and brilliant. Now, the left was annihilated. The stage held only Stalin and his new ally, Bukharin. Bukharin naively thought he and Stalin were close comrades. Lenin had once called Bukharin the favorite child of the whole party. But he was wrong. In the game of power, there is no love, only interests. In 1928, difficulties arose in grain procurement. Without warning, Stalin performed a 180-degree turn. He abandoned Bukharin's moderate policies and picked up the radical industrialization ideas Trotsky had championed years before, only 10 times more radical. He declared the elimination of the kulaks and the start of collectivization. Bukharin was stunned. He ran to reason with Stalin, arguing that this would ruin Soviet agriculture. Stalin looked at him coldly and uttered that famous line, "Are you still a Marxist? You are full of petty bourgeois weakness." Only then did Bukharin realize what he was facing. In a secret meeting, he whispered in terror to the disgraced Kamenev, "Stalin is a Genghis Khan. He will kill us all for power." But it was too late. Stalin controlled all the voting machines. In 1929, Bukharin was stripped of his Politburo membership and branded a rightist capitulationist group. The 21st of December, 1929. This day was Stalin's 50th birthday. This day marked the end of the Great Game. Pravda devoted dozens of pages to birthday articles. On this day, the Soviet media coined a new term, the leader, vozhd. No longer general secretary, no longer comrade, but great leader. Stalin stood at the podium of the celebration assembly, looking down at the audience. Trotsky had been exiled to Prinkipo, Turkey. Zinoviev and Kamenev sat shivering in a corner of the hall, ready to applaud at any moment. Bukharin hung his head, awaiting the judgment of fate. And the cheering crowds below, those new faces, were all apparatchiks, hand-picked by Stalin. They didn't know Lenin, they only recognized Stalin. The Georgian boy once beaten by his father, the outsider in the seminary, the Koba who only knew how to rob banks, the general secretary mocked as a gray blur, had finally completed his revenge. He was no longer a part of anything. He was the party. He was the state. He was the truth. Stalin's victory was not a victory of theory, but a victory of organization. Not a victory of talent, but a victory of will. He spent his life proving one thing. In a brutal power struggle, the person who is despised is often the most dangerous. When Trotsky mocked him as a mediocrity, he didn't realize that Stalin used that very mediocrity to weave a giant net that eventually strangled all the self-righteous geniuses. However, winning power did not mean winning a sense of security. On the contrary, standing at the pinnacle, Stalin felt an unprecedented chill. He knew that those he had defeated did not truly submit in their hearts. He knew that those forced to applaud were cursing him as a usurper behind his back. This fear would transform, within a few years, into a monstrous sea of blood. Since I cannot make you love me, I will make you fear me. Do you want to know how Stalin, after seizing power, used this net to launch the Great Purge and physically eliminate these former rivals? That is the story told in our previous series, The Art of Fear. This is the first half of Joseph Stalin's life, the history of a small man's rise against the odds, and the history of a Red Empire's descent into darkness.